Does the FDA, CDC, Health and Human Services, or any other government agency own patents on any drugs?
Yeah, so it used to be the government didn't own any patents on drugs. All we did from the federal government was give away taxpayer money to drug companies so they could own the patents and make the money. Now, that sounds kind of crazy, but true. So from the 1930s on through today, the NIH has given over $900 billion in grants, much of which has been used by drug companies to then develop drugs that they patented and made money for with nothing coming back to the federal government. That always seemed crazy to me. So the solution was, not my solution, but the solution the government came up with is in 1980, Birch Bayh, one of the senators, and Bob Dole came up with this act that said, okay, if you have federal funding behind it, you can get a patent on this. So the NIH and the doctors behind it can file a patent. Many of them have. Thousands of patents have been done. It's supposed to return some money to the federal government. They're supposed to split it with private industry. Some of the individuals hold it and then they leave government. It hasn't cleaned up the process. All it's done is the problem isn't who holds the patent, in my view. It's the patent itself. It's the idea that you can lock up exclusive rights to a drug for 17 years, 15 years, 12 years, depending on the length of time. We have the longest patents in America of any country, not surprising. In 1960 to 62, Estes Kefauver, who was the crusading Tennessee senator, went after the mafia. He investigated the drug industry. And one of the things he came up with is our patents are much too long. We should make them 5 years or 7 years. And we should force the patent holders to license the drug after 3 years to everybody who wants to come in at a fair right. You think that got anywhere? Not at all. The drug industry went and chopped that apart. So we have these incredibly long patents. With small variations on the drug, they are able to get a new patent. Sometimes I literally have a chapter called One Atom of Difference, in which in the 1950s, they took a very successful antibiotic and the new company changed one atom. It made no difference in the therapy of the drug, made no difference in how it was dispensed, but it qualified to get a patent before the US Patent Office. And there are other instances in which not only do they use products of nature, penicillin and antibiotics, to get patents on this, but they are able to manipulate the patent to hold it for longer than the patent term. So for instance, Eli Lilly held the patent on insulin for nearly 40 years, even though the patent was for only 15, because they changed it just enough to get a new patent and an extension. This happens repeatedly. So the question isn't, does the federal government get the right to hold the patent? The question, I think, is why is the patent system so abused, and why does it work to the benefit of very expensive prices for exclusive drugs for so long instead of generic drugs at an earlier time?
What is the most expensive drug?
Well, Novartis has put out, I think, what will be the most expensive drug. It's just a year ago, in 2020, it's a patent drug that will treat one of the rare neurological diseases. It's priced at $4 million a year. They were originally thinking of $2 million, then they came in at $4 million. They are able to show this very interesting on patent drugs, which are the most expensive drugs in the world. In the 1980s, the US government recognized there was a problem. Pharmaceutical companies were not treating these rare neurological diseases and genetic diseases because the patient populations were very small, might affect only 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 people. So what the government did is they passed a law that for what they call this Orphan Drug Act, and said to the drug companies, come on, we'll incentivize you. We'll give you tax credits. We'll give you breaks. We'll give you a special 7-year patent extension. You'll get a fast process going through the whole thing. You have all types of things to be able to do. The European countries said, okay, if you come up with a crazy price for a drug, $1 million, $1.5 million, you're going to have to prove to us that we, because we have national health, we, the government, pay for health, that what we pay you for that drug is going to save us money over treating the person for that same illness over time. So if Novartis wants to charge $4 million, it has to go into the UK and the United Kingdom and prove to the National Health Service that the National Health Service might have paid $5 million for that very same individual over the period of treatment, and they're going to save $1 million. So the drugs sound incredibly expensive, and they are. Novartis even has a pay-as-you-go plan for governments to be able to pay them in installments over 4 times to show you how expensive it is. And the real question is the extent to which this has been gamed and abused. So the idea of orphan drugs sounded wonderful in the beginning because you're going to treat these small patient populations. And then since then, what has happened is drugs that were originally approved as orphan drugs have been made into general interest drugs, and none of the money that was originally given to them as incentives comes back. Best example of that is Allergan. They had a product called Botox. Botox was originally used as an orphan drug to help this sort of eye problem in which you had a twitching in the eye and it wasn't controllable. The same thing with the throat. Orphan drug funding gets it approved. Eventually, it's used for cosmetic purposes and is used widely and becomes one of the most successful multi-billion-dollar drugs. Once it becomes that, you would think that Allergan might be under some obligation under the law to give back some of the incentive it got for the original development of an orphan drug. It doesn't give back anything to the taxpayer. And there are other instances in which individuals or companies get approval for orphan drugs at exorbitant prices, and then just when the patent is about to expire, they slice a new part of the market off. So they say, okay, we have this approved. Okay, now we're going to make it for pediatric use only. So we'll make it just for children. Now it gets a new patent and a whole new series of income for years to come. It's unfortunately abused and gamed, and nobody's doing anything to fill that in Washington or in Congress or the FDA.
What actions would you take if you were the head of the FDA and had full authority to fix the medical and pharmaceutical industry?
It's a great question. I've thought many times, what could I do if I had the magic wand to run what was happening at the FDA? And that's the sad answer is there's no magic wand. So if anybody thinks there's one answer, by the way, let's do X, Y, and Z, and we'll have nirvana, it's not going to happen. There are plenty of areas for improvement. So I could tell you along the way how I would close the loopholes, for instance, in orphan drugs, how I would close the loopholes, for instance, on what I call controlled substances and what's happened, how I would make pharmaceutical companies supply. You do a test, a clinical test for your drug beforehand. You're going to have to submit it to us. We want to see it. You can't hold back on the information and cherry pick what you want. We want to see it all. I would make it an obligation, a criminal duty, if they violated it, as they got information that received a critical mass on what I call adverse effects and reports of adverse effects. They couldn't decide not to disclose it to the FDA. They have to turn it over. Let me tell you, one of the biggest problems with all those rule changes, the FDA is outmanned, outstaffed, and outgunned at every stage by the drug industry. The FDA is supposed to do the tests on all the foreign production laboratories that make generic drugs. China makes about 90% of the generic drugs together with India that come in. The FDA is supposed to send representatives over there and examine those laboratories. They haven't even been doing that under COVID. They're already stressed on even examining by random the laboratories and tests that they're supposed to do in the United States, much less abroad. They don't have the staff to compete with what the drug companies do. So the drug companies come in for an application for a new drug and they paper them to death. They send in literally tens of thousands of sheets of paper. They hire law firms and consultants. They send it all in at once. If something's in there that might raise somebody's eyebrows, buried in underneath 20 different reams of paper, and the FDA doesn't have the staff to be able to go through each drug application in the same way. In addition, one last thing. The FDA has made a process where you can get a faster review of your drug. And guess what that's allowed for? Not because the drug is important, not because it's a life-saving drug, not because we need it tomorrow, but because you pay more for it. So if a drug company pays an additional fee, it gets an expedited basis. And as a result, it rushes through. The FDA has even less chance to pay attention to all the details of it. It gets it approved for more, but since it's helping to fund the FDA budget, they like those drugs. And that's a conflict that shouldn't exist. One last thing. I would stop tomorrow the revolving door that allows FDA officials to leave the government and go to work for the companies that they were regulating and approving. No better example than the opioid crisis. The FDA official, Dr. Wright, Curtis Wright, who approved OxyContin with all types of questionable things in 1996, guess where he went to work? He goes to Purdue Pharma. His assistant who worked at FDA goes to work for Purdue Pharma. The people who created the orphan drug laws, they went into their own consulting firm to work for Pharma to show them how to game the system and get orphan drugs through. That should stop. And let me give one example of what I think is wrong at the FDA, a prime example. The Biden administration recently appointed an acting chief of the FDA, Janet Woodcock, and they need somebody at the helm of the FDA that's good because they need a veteran, somebody experienced. She's been there for over 25 years, and they want somebody to run that agency well with COVID going on and everything else. I just wrote an editorial in USA Today a couple of weeks ago about why she should not be nominated as the permanent head of the FDA, even though she has a lot of supporters. She allowed the opioid crisis to play out under her watch for 25 years. She was the chief cop, in essence, at the FDA at the time when these approvals in Purdue came back time and time again and didn't get regulated and got things on the label that allowed it to continue to grow. There are opioid victims who believe that she's one of the primary reasons the opioid crisis is as large as it is. But guess who likes her? The pharmaceutical industry. She's viewed as industry friendly. So they're pushing her nomination. And I tell you that I think that this is a test. There are some very good people that also are on the short list for the FDA commissioner. They're not going to solve the agency overnight. But I would be very disappointed if this administration ends up putting Janet Woodcock in as the permanent nomination to run the agency, because her history is such that she should be disqualified. And I say that time and time again. She's competent, she knows what she's done, but she's also industry friendly, and she has problems in the opioid history. She should not be running the FDA, and we'll see what happens under this administration.